Blizzard has just announced their anticipated rework of the Mythic Plus system. Mythic Plus has made several advancements since its inception in Legion, but as World of Warcraft systems have advanced, the player base has optimized Mythic Plus, and it's fallen into a repetitive, sometimes frustrating game mode. In a recent interview with game director Ian Hazzikostas and associate game director Morgan Day, they have hinted at an overhaul and a philosophy shift that is moving away from the one-size-fits-all approach. As of today, we now have exactly what direction Blizzard plans to push the realm of Mythic Plus in, and I have to say, it looks promising. Let's not waste any more time and dive right into it. There are a few things to cover from this article, and always I will leave it down in the description below for anyone wanting to read this post for themselves. I'm also going to include the interview of Morgan and Ian themselves. First, Blizzard is retiring all affixes for the foreseeable future. There are also changes about what key levels Fortified and Tyrannical are going to be introduced at. This is also followed by themed affixes that act as a kiss curse without much restriction. And finally, the removal of inconsistency for players pushing the upper echelon of keys. So there's a lot to unpack here, so let's get into it. First, it's worth noting that all of your favorites, or maybe least favorite, of the affixes are now being retired. This includes Sanguine, Bolstering, Raging, and Bursting. These affixes, while adding variance to the average player, had created too much inconsistency from week to week at the top end of play. With a new revamp system, these affixes are clearly going to need to leave. Along with this, the new affixes that were announced just a few weeks ago are also being removed, and this included Reckless, Focused, Attuned, and Thorned. These affixes had several flaws, and offered too much reward for certain classes over others. With this, there was concern of pigeonholing comps from week to week. These were extremely short-lived, and personally, I'm glad to see them go. While I wasn't able to test all of the affixes on several classes, there were some clear issues with certain pulls when paired with Fortified and the accompanying affixes. Generally speaking, it was definitely the wrong direction for the game to be moving in, so say goodbye to those. This next change is pretty big, and it's not quite in the same order as the article, but I think it's going to help explain how the new affixes will be working. So instead of Tyrannical and Fortified being introduced at the level 2 affix level, they're now going to be introduced at level 4. While this change itself seems a little silly, it'll offer a better difficulty curve between Mythic 0 and Mythic Keystones. Along with this, the counter affix will also then be implemented at level 10 instead. So now each week, if you are someone who ventures beyond the level 9 keystone, you're going to have a more consistent dungeon experience because both mobs and bosses will be slightly more difficult. I'll talk more about the pros and cons of this near the end of the video, but let's talk about the meat of this new overhaul. The best way to describe these new affixes are, well, I don't know, seasonal affixes? But unlike seasonal affixes in the past, these are actually going to rotate from week to week. We currently are unsure about how many are going to exist and what the rotation might look like, but let's take a look at what we currently know from the article posted. So far, there are 2 different affixes that are going to be introduced at the level 2 level, and these are always going to be called Xal'atath's Bargain, insert name of affix here. So one of them is going to be Xal'atath's Bargain Ascendant. This affix reads, while in combat, Xal'atath rains down orbs of cosmic energy that attempt to empower nearby enemies, increasing their haste and movement speed. If players disrupt these orbs, they claim this effect for themselves. Now, this is definitely a little more interesting than some of the other one that's been announced, so let's talk briefly about it. The way I see this working, based on text alone, might be similar to something like Sanguine. But instead of a pool dying when a mob dies, a swirly of sorts will spawn, and the tank, or I guess your group in this case, might want to make sure that the mobs are not standing in it, while players will want to focus on being inside of it when it erupts or explodes. Simple enough. This has some obvious drawbacks since there may be other ground effects cluttering the space, or the distance needed to travel. The other way I see this working is an explosive type affix. And the reason I say this is because of the verbiage, if players disrupt these orbs. So instead of killing an orb-like explosive, you might need to interrupt it before it completes its cast. This could be interesting, but with how frequent mobs cast in dungeons, it seems a little counterintuitive with the recent design shift of increased casts, lower player CC. My only major complaint about this affix, without testing of course or seeing how it works, is that some classes benefit from haste way more than others. We also don't know the amount of haste you're going to get or the frequency of the spawn rate. An educated guess might land you in the realm between 30 seconds to 90 seconds while in combat, similar to the spawn rate of the retired affixes Afflicted or Incorporeal. Either way, this is a new Kiss Curse effect that seems to benefit all players. The second affix is called Xal'atath's Bargain Frenzied, and this is an homage to the old school Raging, tied with the short-lived affixes of the previous beta build. And it reads, non-boss enemies become frenzied at 30% health, increasing their haste by 40%, but increasing their damage taken by 20%. Obviously, this is also a slight Kiss Curse effect. Mobs are going to begin swinging pretty hard until they die, but should die pretty quickly. We have seen effects like this from specific dungeon mobs in the past, but now it's going to affect all mobs. Slightly concerning in certain pulls, but it won't really be a problem in higher keys. And what's unique about these affixes is that once players hit the level 12 range or higher of keys, these affixes are actually going to be disabled and a new affix will take its place called Xal'atath's Guile. This affix reads, Xal'atath betrays players, revoking her bargains and increasing the health and damage of enemies by 20%. Any player pushing with a group or in pugs will find this a little bit more consistent feeling from week to week, which is the main objective of this shift in affixes. Before we talk about the layout and key structure, as well as my overall thoughts of these affixes, the last thing that I do want to mention is the level 7 key affix, which seems to be pretty stagnant and won't rotate from week to week. This is called Challenger's Peril, and it reads, dying subtracts 15 seconds from the time remaining rather than 5. The idea of this affix is simple, to really emphasize precise gameplay from players in these keys. Overall, I like the idea of these new affixes, and the shift in implementation is to really move the focus and difficulty of the dungeon to the actual dungeon itself. Mobs are either becoming enraged, and there's more modifiers involved instead of just more things for players to deal with. Overall, I think the philosophy is good. Briefly, let's talk about key progression since I did jump around quite a bit. So starting at level 2, players will immediately start dealing with Xal'atath's Bargain. This includes either the Enraged effect or the undetermined amount of haste and movement speed. Now, it's worth reiterating that these affixes contain a Kiss curse. So you're going to want to keep mobs from getting the haste buff from the raining orbs or the frenzied case. Once mobs hit 30% health, you're going to need to kite or peel or unload big damage. Something that players are pretty used to doing anyways. Then at level 4, they're going to introduce either fortified or tyrannical depending on the week. Then whichever affix becomes relevant at level 4, the former and or the latter will kick in at level 10. In between the level 10 and the level 4 affixes, you're going to have the level 7 key affix, which is now increasing the penalty of deaths, resulting in a 15-second loss instead of 5. Then, of course, as aforementioned, Tyrannical or Fortified kicks in again at level 10. For those who are pushing a higher level of gameplay or are interested in climbing the ladder or aiming for title, level 12 keystones will remove the affix and simply just bolster all mobs in the dungeon, creating a consistent damage and healing profile. All around, seems like great changes and definitely will, or at least hopefully, reinvigorate the Mythic Plus system, which has been greatly needed. There are, of course, a few concerns. Obviously, we don't know all the other affixes that are going to be in play and how many weeks or rotations there will be. Luckily, for players who do push keys, you don't have to worry about it. Along with that, we barely know how these are actually going to function in keys, but most players do enjoy Kiss Curse effects, so I'm going to try to stay optimistic here. The only other concern I really have is going to affect the players over the level 12 mark. As most players know, there is the one-shot dilemma that happens from week to week, and obviously as keys go higher. Some abilities are overtuned, or they're simply unmanageable depending on the week. The result is an extremely strict meta at the top end of play. While variables with affixes will be going away, there is now an additional modifier that could result in some additional tuning required. Blizzard had a tendency throughout all of Dragonflight to overtune abilities and keep them in that state for weeks, months, or even seasons. Part of this was due to the rotating dungeon pool, but also due to the complete overhaul of class design and as a result of the updated class talent trees. In moving into the War Within, it's going to be imperative that Blizzard tunes things properly and consistently, or players pushing keys are going to hit a pretty hard wall quickly, which will result in us running into the same problem we are currently. The new modifiers will not only include the natural scaling of health and damage with key level, but also having Fortified, Tyrannical, and Xal'atath's Guile in play. Obviously, there hasn't been any testing yet, but I am eager to get my toes wet with these changes this week. Anyways, I know a ton of content creators have already voiced their praise and concerns across all social media platforms, but what do you think? Let me know down below. Of course, a massive shout out to all my lovely Patreon supporters, because without you guys, there would be much less videos like this. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.